The room was quiet, but the silence between two people who feel too much is never truly empty. It hums. It waits. It listens. You were not the loudest person in the place, nor the one trying to be noticed. That was the strange part. Attention often follows those who chase it, but interest, real interest, tends to drift toward the ones who don't. She looked at you longer than she should have for a simple conversation. Not because you were trying to impress her, but because you weren't. That difference changes everything. Then you spoke. Not quickly. Not nervously. Not like someone rehearsing lines they found online. You spoke like a man who had nothing to prove and everything already understood. "I've noticed something about you," you said, calmly, as if you were stating a fact about the weather. She raised her eyes slightly, not fully expecting what came next. "You don't try to be seen, but you can't really be ignored." There was a pause after that. A small one. But in that pause, something shifted. Not attraction in the obvious sense, but recognition. The kind that bypasses logic and goes straight to feeling. Stoicism was never about being cold. It was about being unshaken. And in that stillness, there is a strange kind of magnetism that people don't know how to resist. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to decide whether that compliment was real or carefully constructed. But it didn't sound constructed. It sounded observed. Lived. "You make silence feel comfortable," you added, your voice still steady, almost detached, yet deeply aware. "Most people rush to fill it. You don't. You let it exist." That was the second layer. Not praise. Not flattery. Something closer to recognition of character. And that is where attraction stops being superficial and starts becoming something harder to name. Her expression changed subtly, not dramatically, but enough for you to notice. People always think attraction is loud. It rarely is. It's in the smallest adjustments, the way someone stops performing and starts being present. You didn't rush to close the moment. That would have ruined it. Stoicism teaches restraint, not absence of feeling, but mastery over it. And so you simply continued, as if there was no urgency in your words at all. "I think most people misunderstand strength," you said quietly. "They think it's about control over others. But real strength is how still you remain when you don't need anything from anyone." Her gaze lingered now. Not searching for validation anymore, but understanding. And that is where the shift begins, the moment a person stops trying to impress and starts being seen. You could feel it building, not as tension, but as awareness. The space between you wasn't shrinking. It was deepening. And before the moment could settle into conclusion, before it could be defined or labeled or dismissed, you let your voice soften just slightly, as if you were revealing something not meant to be owned by anyone. "There's something about you that doesn't ask for attention," you said. "But somehow, it teaches people to give it willingly." Her breath changed, almost imperceptibly. And just as the weight of that statement began to settle in the air, just as her silence started to carry more meaning than words ever could, you didn't stop. Because what came next wasn't meant to complete anything. It was only meant to go deeper. The moment hung there, unclaimed, like something neither of you had decided to own yet. She didn't look away this time. That was new. Most people escape intensity when they feel it rising. They break eye contact, laugh, reach for their phone, or create noise to dilute what they can't control. But she stayed. Not frozen, aware. And in that awareness, something subtle began to shift again. You noticed it first in the smallest detail, the way her shoulders relaxed, just slightly, as if her body had stopped preparing for performance. Not because she felt safe, but because she no longer felt the need to defend herself from you. "You speak like you've already understood people," she said at last, her voice lower than before. There was no challenge in it. Only curiosity. You didn't rush to answer. Stoicism teaches that silence is not absence, it is selection. Choosing what deserves to exist in speech. "I don't think people need to be understood quickly," you replied. "Most of them are revealed slowly. Like time does the work, not words." That line settled differently in the space between you. It wasn't designed to impress, but it landed like something that had been true long before it was spoken. Her gaze shifted for the first time, not away, but deeper, as if she was no longer looking at what you said, but at the way you were choosing to exist while saying it. "You make it sound simple," she said softly. "But it doesn't feel simple when you're the one being seen like that." That was the opening most people miss. Because the real moment was no longer about complimenting her. It was about what she was beginning to admit without saying directly, that being seen properly can feel more intense than being desired. You leaned slightly back, not distancing, but allowing space to breathe. "Then don't think of it as being seen," you said calmly. "Think of it as being noticed without distortion. Most people don't actually see others, they project them. You don't feel that with me." There it was. Not a compliment in the usual sense. Something cleaner. More dangerous in its honesty. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied you in a way that felt different from before, not as someone evaluating charm, but as someone trying to understand restraint. Because restraint is what people rarely trust at first. It feels too controlled, too deliberate, too unfamiliar. And yet, something about it pulls them in anyway. "You don't try to fill the space," she finally said. "You just let it exist, even when it gets uncomfortable." A faint pause followed. Not tension this time. Recognition. Because she was no longer describing you from the outside. She was beginning to feel what it was like to be inside the atmosphere you created. And that realization changes the direction of everything, even if nothing has moved yet. You looked at her, not with intensity, not with pursuit, but with stillness that didn't ask for a response. "I think most people confuse presence with pressure," you said. "They think if something feels strong, it must be forcing its way in. But real presence doesn't push. It stays." Her eyes didn't leave yours. And in that moment, something unspoken began to form again. Something deeper than admiration, something closer to the quiet discomfort of being understood in a way you didn't prepare for. She exhaled slowly, almost like she was adjusting to a new weight in the air. "I don't know what you're doing," she said, almost under her breath. But she didn't move away. And that was the point where the conversation stopped being about compliments entirely, and started becoming something neither of you had fully stepped out of yet. You didn't answer her immediately. Not because you were searching for words, but because you were allowing the moment to remain unedited. Most people ruin connection by trying to define it too early. Naming something too soon makes it smaller than it is. You understood that instinctively, so you let the silence do what it was already doing, expanding. "I'm not doing anything," you finally said, calm and steady. That's the part most people find confusing. A faint shift crossed her expression again. Not confusion exactly. More like recalibration. As if she was trying to adjust her understanding of you without losing her own balance in the process. "That's not true," she said softly. "You are doing something. I just can't tell what it is." You almost smiled, but didn't let it fully form. Because the truth was simpler than it appeared. "I'm just not competing for attention," you said. "I'm not trying to be chosen, or approved, or interpreted quickly. I think people feel that absence and mistake it for strategy." That landed differently. Not as persuasion, but as reflection. Her eyes lowered briefly, not away, but inward. Like she was checking something inside herself rather than reacting to you. And when she looked back up, there was less resistance in her gaze. "You make it feel like I don't have to perform," she said, quieter now. That was the shift beneath the shift. Because performance is what most interactions are built on, subtle, unconscious, constant. People shape themselves to be received. They adjust their tone, their posture, their identity in small invisible ways just to remain acceptable. And when someone doesn't require that from you, it creates a strange kind of discomfort before it becomes comfort. You let the word sit for a moment before responding. "I don't think you were performing," you said. "I think you were just aware that most people expect it." That distinction changed something in her expression again. Not dramatically. Not instantly. But enough that the distance between you didn't feel like distance anymore. It felt like space that had stopped being defensive. Outside, the world continued as if nothing important was happening. That's how these moments usually are. They don't announce themselves. They don't demand recognition. They simply exist, quietly reorganizing how two people perceive each other. She leaned back slightly, but not away. More like she was finally allowing herself to settle into the moment instead of managing it. "You talk like someone who has already decided what matters," she said. You considered that for a second. Then answered honestly. "I think it's less about deciding," you said, "and more about removing what doesn't." A pause followed again. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was full of something neither of you were rushing to interrupt. And just as the air between you began to feel like it was forming a new kind of understanding, something quieter, deeper, less explainable, she spoke again, almost as if she was testing the edge of this new space you had both stepped into. "If I stopped trying to understand you completely," she said, "what would be left?" You held her gaze, steady and unhurried. And instead of answering directly, you let the silence stretch just a little longer. What would be left? Her question lingered between you like something fragile that could either dissolve or become real depending on how it was handled. You didn't rush it. Most people would. Most people try to seal uncertainty immediately, as if ambiguity is a problem that needs fixing. But you let it breathe, because you understood something she was only beginning to feel, that not everything valuable needs to be defined to exist. "What would be left," you said finally, your voice steady, "is exactly what's already here. Without interpretation." She didn't respond at first. Not because she didn't understand, but because she was feeling the weight of what that meant. No projection. No assumption. No story built in advance. Just presence. And presence, when experienced directly, feels heavier than explanation. Her eyes stayed on you longer now, but something had softened in them. Not weakness. Not surrender. Something closer to honesty that hadn't been fully allowed before. "That sounds easy," she said quietly, "but it doesn't feel easy." You nodded slightly, acknowledging without correcting. "It isn't," you replied. "Most things that matter aren't." A faint silence followed again, but this time it didn't feel like distance. It felt like depth. She shifted slightly in her seat, not uncomfortable, but no longer guarded in the same way. As if her internal posture was changing without her asking it to. "I think I spend too much time trying to figure out what people want from me," she admitted, almost reluctantly. "And I adjust before they even ask." There it was. Not a confession for validation. Just observation finally spoken out loud. You didn't interrupt it. You let it complete itself. "That's not unusual," you said. "It's just tiring when you do it long enough." She gave a small, almost invisible nod. And for a moment, neither of you spoke. Because something had changed in the structure of the interaction. It was no longer a performance of connection. It was becoming a shared awareness of how connection is usually distorted, and what happens when it isn't. "You don't seem like you need anything from anyone," she said eventually, her voice lower now. You looked at her for a second longer than before. "I think needing less," you said, "just makes space feel different. Not empty, just clearer." She repeated that idea silently in her expression, as if testing it against everything she had known before. And then, very quietly, she said something that shifted everything again. "Being around you feels like I don't have to be more than I am." The air tightened, not in tension, but in significance. Because statements like that don't come from surface attraction. They come from recognition of relief. Of being unpressed. Unshaped. Uncorrected. You didn't respond immediately. Instead, you let the moment fully arrive, without trying to move it forward or soften it. And just as it began to settle into something deeper, something neither of you had named yet, something still unfolding beneath language, you noticed she wasn't looking away anymore. Not even slightly. And you realized this conversation hadn't been about compliments for a long time. It had become something else entirely, and it was still continuing. You let her words sit there without rushing to decorate them with meaning. Because the moment you try to label something like that too quickly, you reduce it to something safe, and what was forming between you wasn't safe in the usual sense. It was honest. And honesty, when it first appears, always feels slightly unstable. I don't think you're used to that, you said finally. She looked at you, not defensive this time, just attentive. Used to what? She asked. To not having to adjust. A brief silence followed. Not heavy, but reflective. Her gaze dropped for a second, like she was checking whether that statement matched her experience. And it did, but not in a comforting way. More like a mirror she hadn't stood in front of for a while. I didn't realize I was adjusting, she said quietly. It just felt normal. You nodded slightly, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement of how deeply patterns can integrate themselves into identity without permission being asked. That's how most patterns survive, you said. They don't announce themselves. They just become familiar enough that you stop questioning them. She exhaled softly, almost like she was releasing something she hadn't realized she was holding. For a moment, the conversation didn't move forward. It didn't need to, because something internal had already started shifting its weight. And then she spoke again, but slower this time. When you say things like that, it doesn't feel like you're analyzing me, she said. It feels like you're just seeing me without trying to change me. You didn't immediately respond. Not because you didn't know what to say, but because anything rushed would have broken the tone that had formed. I think people confuse seeing with correcting, you said eventually. They think understanding someone gives them the right to reshape them. Her eyes held yours a little longer this time. And you don't think that? She asked. No, you said simply. I think understanding should make things clearer, not smaller. A quiet pause followed again. But now, something had changed in the quality of silence itself. It wasn't empty waiting anymore. It felt structured, like both of you were becoming more careful with what entered it. She leaned slightly forward, not aggressively, just present. I don't usually talk like this with people, she admitted. It feels different. You studied her for a moment, not evaluating, just observing. Different doesn't mean wrong, you said. It just means unfamiliar. That line didn't land like advice. It landed like permission. And for a brief second, she didn't respond, not because she had nothing to say, but because she seemed to be experiencing the absence of pressure to respond correctly. Then she said something quieter, almost uncertain. I think I like this version of me more. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were honest in a way that didn't ask for approval. You didn't amplify it. You didn't try to turn it into something bigger. You just let it exist. That's usually what happens, you said. When you stop performing for the room, you start noticing yourself again. Her expression softened slightly at that, not toward you, but toward the realization forming inside her. And for the first time, she didn't seem to be evaluating the interaction. She was inside it. Fully. And just as that realization settled between you both, as if the conversation had quietly crossed into deeper territory without announcing it, she opened her mouth again, like there was still something she hadn't allowed herself to say yet. And then she hesitated. Not the kind of hesitation that comes from uncertainty, but the kind that appears when a thought has been carried for too long without permission to leave. I usually feel like I have to earn attention, she said finally. Even in small moments. Even when I don't want to. She didn't look away while saying it. That mattered. Because this wasn't a statement designed to be accepted or rejected. It was simply something that had been true for a long time and had finally found air. You didn't respond immediately. You let it finish itself. I can tell, you said eventually, not as judgment, but as recognition. She didn't flinch at that. If anything, she seemed relieved that it wasn't denied. A quiet breath followed. And you don't? She asked. The question wasn't accusatory. It was genuinely curious now. You considered it for a moment. I think everyone does in some way, you said. The difference is whether they notice it happening or not. That answer didn't close the space, it widened it. Because it didn't place you above her. It placed both of you inside the same human pattern, just with different levels of awareness. She nodded slowly, processing that. I didn't think awareness could feel like this, she said. How does it feel? You asked. She looked down briefly, then back up. Like I don't have to keep running in my own head, she admitted. Even for a few seconds. That sentence stayed in the air longer than the others. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet truth, rare, unpolished, unprotected. You leaned back slightly, still present, still grounded. That's usually what happens when you stop trying to manage how you're being perceived, you said. The mind gets quieter. Not because it disappears, but because it's not fighting as much. She watched you carefully now, not as someone trying to decode you, but as someone measuring what it feels like to be understood without distortion. I don't think I've met someone who talks like this before, she said softly. You have, you replied. You just didn't feel safe enough to slow down long enough to notice it. That line didn't create distance. It removed it. And for a moment, neither of you spoke again. The space between you wasn't tense anymore. It was steady. Like something had stopped being negotiated and started being experienced. Then she tilted her head slightly, almost as if a new thought had surfaced beneath everything else. If I stayed like this, without adjusting, would people still stay around me? She asked. The question wasn't really about others. It was about fear disguised as curiosity. You looked at her, steady and calm. Some won't, you said honestly. But the ones who remain won't require you to disappear to do it. She didn't answer immediately, but something in her expression changed again, not uncertainty this time. Something closer to the beginning of release. And just as that realization started to settle deeper, as if she was beginning to test what it would mean to exist without constant adjustment, she opened her mouth again. But she didn't finish the sentence. Instead, she paused, as if the words themselves had changed shape halfway to being spoken. I think I'm scared of what happens if I stop trying so hard, she admitted finally, quieter now. Like, I won't know who I am without it. That was the core of it. Not attention. Not attraction. Not even understanding. Identity tied to effort. You didn't interrupt. You let it fully exist in the space between you. Because this kind of honesty doesn't need correction, it needs to be heard without being reshaped. That fear makes sense, you said calmly. When something has been part of your identity for long enough, removing it feels like losing yourself. Even if it's only a habit. She looked at you, searching for disagreement, maybe even reassurance. But you didn't offer either. You stayed with clarity. And if I stop adjusting, she said slowly, what if people leave? You nodded slightly, acknowledging the reality of that fear rather than trying to erase it. Some will, you repeated. But not because you became less. Because they were attached to the version of you that was easiest for them to interpret. That landed differently this time. Not as comfort. As truth she couldn't immediately argue with. Her gaze dropped for a moment, then returned. That sounds lonely, she said. It can be at first, you replied. But loneliness from authenticity doesn't last the same way. It's not the kind that drains you. It's the kind that clears space. A silence followed again, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was processing. She leaned back slightly, like her body was beginning to accept something her mind was still adjusting to. I don't know how to do that, she said honestly. Just be without adjusting. You didn't rush to teach her. Because this wasn't a technique. It wasn't something to be performed correctly. It's not something you force, you said. It happens in small moments where you notice you're about to adjust, and you don't. She considered that quietly. Almost like she was replaying her entire way of being through that lens. And then, she asked, then you see what remains. That sentence lingered. Not dramatic. Not poetic. Just final in its simplicity. Her eyes stayed on you longer now, but softer, less guarded. As if something inside her had stopped trying to hold everything in place at once. I feel like I'm learning something about myself I avoided for a long time, she said. You nodded once. Most people don't avoid themselves, you said. They just stay busy enough not to meet themselves fully. She exhaled slowly. And for the first time, the silence between you didn't feel like continuation or waiting. It felt like transition, as if something had already started changing in her, quietly, beneath everything spoken. And just as she was about to respond again, this time with something less defended, more real, she stopped, as if realizing there was still another layer she hadn't allowed herself to touch yet. She stopped mid-thought, not because she forgot what she wanted to say, but because she suddenly realized she was no longer speaking from the surface of herself. I think, she began again, then paused. Her voice softened. I think I don't even know what I would be like without all of this anymore. There it was. Not confusion about you. Confusion about herself. You watched her carefully, not analyzing, just present enough to notice the shift in how she carried her words now, less like defense, more like exposure. That's not a problem, you said. That's just unfamiliar territory. She gave a faint, almost unnoticeable smile, but it wasn't directed at humor. It was recognition mixed with uncertainty. Unfamiliar territory, she repeated quietly. That makes it sound less scary than it feels. Most things do, you replied. Until you stay in them long enough to realize they don't actually harm you. They just remove what was covering you. A pause. This time, she didn't rush to fill it. Instead, she looked down at her hands briefly, as if noticing them differently than before. I always thought being liked meant I was doing something right, she said, almost to herself. Like it was proof. You didn't interrupt that thought. You let it complete its shape. But now, she continued slowly, I'm starting to think maybe I was just being manageable. The word hung there. Manageable. Not cruel. Not dramatic. Just accurate in a way that made it difficult to ignore. You nodded slightly. That's what a lot of people become without realizing it, you said. They optimize themselves for acceptance instead of truth. She looked back at you at that, and this time there was no resistance in her gaze. Only quiet reflection. And truth doesn't always get accepted, she said. No, you agreed. But it doesn't need acceptance to remain true. That line settled deeper than the others. Not because it was new, but because it removed something she had been leaning on without noticing. Another silence followed, but this one was different again. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't light. It was open. She shifted slightly, as if adjusting to the absence of her usual internal structure. I feel strange, she admitted. Like I'm not performing, but I also don't know what I'm supposed to do with myself right now. You're not supposed to do anything with it, you said. That's the part that feels uncomfortable at first. There's nothing to manage. Her eyes stayed on you longer this time, as if testing whether that was really possible. And if I just stay like this, she asked, without adjusting back? You didn't answer immediately. Because the answer wasn't something to hand to her, it was something she was already stepping toward on her own. But you spoke anyway, gently. Then you start noticing what was always there underneath the adjustment. A long pause followed. And for the first time, she didn't try to close the space, or define it, or escape it. She simply stayed. And in that stillness, something unspoken began to form, not between two people trying to impress each other, but between two moments of awareness quietly crossing paths, and continuing forward without needing permission to do so.